I'm going to look at the best performing funds of 2023 from a report from Yodelar dated early December 2023. I have no affiliation with Yodelar or any other investment company, and this is not advice. So as always, do your own research. Yodelar say that 28% of funds returned negative performance over the period they looked at. The greatest growth was 38%, but the average fund growth was only 3%. So their best fund, interestingly enough, was a passive fund, the L&G Global Technology Index, which has also been a consistent performer across 3 and 5 years, and they give it a 5-star overall rating, which I would agree with. The other top performers are also within the tech sphere, with the iShares S&P 500 US tech sector also giving a strong performance. Nasdaq has done well, and they have a Nasdaq ESG variant in their list of top 10 funds. And let's look at that in a bit more detail. So here's the fact sheet for the Nasdaq ESG ETF, and it says companies are evaluated and weighted on the basis of their business activities, controversies, and ESG risk ratings. Although I think the fundamental driver seems to be market capitalization, because we've got the usual suspects of Microsoft, Apple, and Nvidia being the top 3 performers. IT, a very strong weighting at 60%. But do note that the Nasdaq 100 does not contain any banks within it, and overall this ETF has 93 holdings. So it's interesting to see whether ESG does lead to outperformance, and I think the jury is kind of out on that one. So next up we have the best global funds, but the top performers have a very strong tech weighting, and they're kind of technology funds just in disguise. So things like Guinness Global Innovators, GAM Disruptive Growth, they do invest outside of technology, so they're more of a growth fund. But some of them have very patchy growth, so they have quite low ratings from Yodelar, which again I would agree with. My favorite, the Royal London Global Equity Select, it's rated 5 stars, came in 6th in the past year, 3rd over 3 years, 2nd over 5 years, which I think is pretty good. It's got Blue Whale in the top 10, which I think is a bit hit and miss, so I'd kind of agree with the 3-star weighting. But let's have a look at BlackRock Global Unconstrained, which is a fairly new fund. So here we are with BlackRock Global Unconstrained. It's already got a silver rating from Morningstar, which is pretty good. It's got fees of 0.9%, so it's kind of on a par with Fundsmith Holdings 22, so it's quite concentrated. PE ratio 36, price to book 8.96. Wow, I mean, this is it's pushing it. It's pushing it, and it's not necessarily the thing you'd really want to hold too much money in, because it looks like it's really trying to push it in terms of it's putting in as its holdings. So Microsoft number 1, Novo Nordisk, LVMH. So yeah, quite a few of the Fundsmith favorites. So it's using quite similar tactics to some of the more popular large global funds. So it's a bit take it or leave it really as to whether you want this fund or not. The other thing to consider is whether you want your technology to be within a specific tech fund, or whether you want technology to be within your global fund and your US fund or your European fund. Because the danger is if you overweight too many of your funds towards technology, when there's a tech downturn, lots of your funds will underperform. Whereas if your tech holding is more concentrated, then you can maybe more easily monitor it, and you'll kind of know where your exposure is, and you can put that tech fund more in your longer term basket of funds and just let it do its thing over the next 10 or 20 years. Next up, we've got North American funds. So we've got the IT sector coming in at number 1, then the Nasdaq ESG, this Netaxis Loomis Sales, that is an active fund. A little bit mixed in terms of the performance. I don't find that US active funds really do that well. It's quite difficult to beat the S&P 500 because it already has some built-in screening around only letting in companies with 2 consecutive quarters of profitability. So you're probably better off for your US exposure to be more passive than active, but there's maybe 1 or 2 in here that are worthy of further research. So when it comes to the UK, it's interesting how Special Situations Fund has come in at number 1, so a bit more of a kind of value focus really, but it can take quite a while for the value to truly materialize. This HSBC multi-factor, fairly new. I think it's only available through one broker. I had a little look on Pick a Fund. And again, undervalued assets from Man GLG. So again, that's kind of like a value fund. BlackRock Institutional Equity Funds UK Select looked interesting, but when I looked it up on Pick a Fund, it said it's not available on any platform. So I'll discard that. For the UK, I do like the look of the Wisdom Tree UK dividend growth quality factor as well. That new ETF is possibly going to have some of the more interesting UK companies, and that'll be what I have my eye on in the near future. Asian funds haven't been something I've looked at much. The sector average had a negative return over 1 year and over 3 years. Some of the better performers are the smaller cap ones, and the company Matthews has quite a good reputation, and that seems to have the best performing fund over 5 years. So maybe this will be an area to look at in 2024 because there's probably some quite good value hidden here. For European funds, there are a few of interest. Artemis do a whole smart GARP growth at a reasonable price range of funds, but it looks like it's only their European one that's made it into any of the top 10 rankings. There's also this WS Arditour, never heard of this one, and they say it's quite small at 161 million. The Quilter Fund, I think that's only available through investment advisors. What I'll do is take a bit more of a look at this Wisdom Tree Europe Equity ETF because it's done reasonably well and I'm going to try and understand it a bit more. So here's the Wisdom Tree fact sheet. It says it selects based on dividend paying companies with a global revenue exposure. So the companies have 50% or more of their revenues from countries outside Europe, and it's tilted towards things like quality and ESG criteria. So it's quite similar to their quality dividend growth range. But it does have some interesting companies within it. Bit of a shame on the banks, which I wouldn't have liked to have seen. But this looks fairly interesting for a passive fund and exposure to some of the more quality parts of Europe. And then also you get a fairly decent dividend yield off the back of it as well. For emerging markets, it's not surprising that the number 1 fund excludes China because China's been having such a terrible time of things recently. Also, small caps tend to do well because, again, they have less of a weighting towards China, and there's possibly some things that are under the radar there. You might get some good growth opportunities. So it's interesting to see how the passive small caps in terms of these ETFs are actually the ones that do well rather than any active funds. So for emerging markets, I'd be a bit cautious, but I've done a video on this and I do quite like some of the small cap emerging market ETFs. Overall, I think this is a pretty good list of funds. I do prefer the consistent returns over, say, 3 and 5 years, as opposed to the intermittent return of just 1 year. I'll be doing a few more videos that look at top performing funds, so watch out for those on the channel.